Go die. My parents screamed. They kicked me out after my sister got fired, so I turned the tables. My name is Jordan Woods. I'm 31 years old, and I live in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, until recently. I thought I understood what family loyalty meant. I thought it was about quietly doing your part, showing up when it's inconvenient, and never keeping score even when you're the only one giving. I thought it meant staying close, even when the ones closest to you forget how to treat you like a person. That illusion died the day my parents told me to disappear. I had just walked in the door from a long day of meetings when I heard my mother's voice shake the hallway. She wasn't yelling at someone on the phone. She was yelling at me, behind her. My father stood silently, his arms folded, nodding in agreement. Tamara sat on the couch with her feet up like a queen who had already won. And in that moment, with my car keys still in my hand and my laptop bag sliding off my shoulder, I knew something had shifted in a way I wouldn't be able to reverse. Let me take you back, because the day they told me to leave didn't start the story. It ended it. The beginning was quieter. It looked a lot like love. Like family dinners and shared stories. Like old Christmas photos where I'm the one holding the camera while everyone else smiles. I was born the oldest daughter of Harold and Lynette Woods. My dad worked for a plumbing and renovation company. My mom taught kindergarten at a local charter school. We didn't grow up with much, but I never felt like we lacked anything. I just learned early to do without when Tamara came along. 2 years younger and impossibly charming. I stepped aside without ever being asked. She got the new outfits, the better birthday parties, the louder applause at school assemblies. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just family dynamics. I was a quiet achiever, the kind of girl who finished projects early and helped classmates without taking credit. I wasn't the one teachers remembered, but I was the one who stayed late to help clean up. By the time I was 15, I was helping my mom with after-school prep and keeping track of the household grocery budget. I didn't mind. Not really. I liked being useful. That's a dangerous word. I've learned. When your worth is measured by your usefulness, you start shrinking your needs so others can stretch theirs. After college, I took a job as a remote creative strategist for a New York branding agency. It paid well enough to support myself and still help out with bills at home around that time. Grandma June started showing signs of dementia. I volunteered to stay with her a few nights a week while my parents juggled work. Tamara was busy finishing her PR degree and building her Instagram presence. She said hospitals made her uncomfortable. For 3 years, I balanced full-time work, part-time caregiving, and still managed to send money home when my dad's hours got cut. Before Grandma June passed, she asked me to sit with her in her sunroom one Sunday afternoon. The summer light came through the blinds in sharp lines across the floor. She took my hand, and in a voice that was still firm despite the cloudiness that had started to dim her mind, she said, "This house is yours, Jordan, not just because you stayed, but because you saw me." I didn't understand what she meant until her attorney, Mr. Ellis, called me a week after her funeral and told me she had transferred the deed into my name 6 months earlier. I was stunned. She'd paid all the legal fees herself, finalized everything before her memory started fading. But I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Tamara. It didn't feel like the right time. I just kept paying the bills, the taxes, the repairs, and let them believe it was still Grandma's house. For the next 2 years, we all lived there. My parents retired early after some medical issues, and Tamara. Fresh out of school, bounced between gigs and influencer contracts. I paid for more than half the groceries, handled the water heater replacement, and quietly picked up the tab when the property tax notice came. They never asked how I managed it, and I never offered. Maybe I thought that if I kept showing up, they'd finally see me as more than the background noise in their lives. Everything shifted the day Tamara got fired. She had landed a flashy role at a lifestyle PR firm downtown. The kind of place with kombucha in the break room and open floor plans. She posted about it nonstop. It was her dream job, she said. But 3 months later, she came home early with her face streaked in mascara and her voice trembling like she was on stage. "They're cutting my department," she said. "I'm back to square one." I held her while she cried. I told her we'd figure it out. I made tea and stayed up helping her update her resume. I thought this would bring us closer. Instead, it brought out something I hadn't seen before, or maybe something I had ignored for too long. Because what came next wasn't just a bad patch, it was the beginning of a reckoning I didn't know I needed. At first, everyone seemed to adjust. Tamara moved her things back into her old room and set up a folding desk next to the window. She hung a vision board filled with printouts of marketing agencies and quotes in gold foil. My parents welcomed her return like a homecoming queen. They made her favorite meals, watched rom-coms with her late into the night, and acted like this was just a pit stop on her fast track back to success. I didn't mind. I figured she needed space to regroup, and I was glad she had people around her to soften the fall. I kept working, kept paying the bills, kept showing up. That's what I'd always done. But little things started shifting. Tamara stopped helping with groceries, explaining that she had to be more mindful of her savings. Then she started sleeping in later, saying that her body was recovering from the burnout of corporate life. By the end of the second week, she had taken over the living room with folders and ring lights, doing practice interviews for jobs she wasn't applying for. When I asked if she needed help researching companies, she brushed me off and said she already had a system. That system, as far as I could tell, involved hours of scrolling social media and waiting for inspiration. I didn't say anything at first, but tension built slowly, like water rising in a sealed room. One night, while I was washing dishes, I heard my dad telling Tamara she needed to focus on herself right now, that Jordan could carry the household a little longer. That sentence stuck in my chest. Carry the household, like it was some temporary favor, not something I had done quietly for years. A few days later, I came home from a 12-hour workday and found my bedroom door open, the rug missing, and my laundry bin relocated. Tamara had decided to switch rooms because she needed more light and creative space for her mental clarity. No one asked. No one warned me when I brought it up. Mom just said, "She's under a lot of pressure. Jordan, be flexible." The next few weeks were a blur of subtle slights and unspoken expectations. My name wasn't included when bills were discussed, even though I paid most of them. If I brought home groceries, no one thanked me. If I missed a family dinner, someone would sigh dramatically and say, "Well, we were all here except Jordan." The more I contributed, the more invisible I became. And when I tried to draw boundaries, they acted like I was selfish for not being more supportive. The first open insult came one Friday night at dinner. Tamara was talking about her latest breakthrough in job clarity, explaining that she was now considering starting her own brand consulting firm. Dad beamed with pride. Mom nodded approvingly. I asked a quiet question about whether she had mapped out her startup costs. She rolled her eyes and said, "Not everyone wants to work safe little jobs forever." Then she laughed. My parents laughed too. I smiled politely. then excused myself to clean up while they opened wine. That night, while wiping down the counters, I realized I hadn't had a single conversation in weeks that wasn't about someone else's future. Things came to a head 2 days later. Tamara had an interview at a trendy firm in Buckhead. At 7 a.m., Mom knocked on my door and said, "Can you take a sick day to drive your sister? She needs support and can't afford an Uber right now." I said no. I had a morning presentation and had already rescheduled twice to accommodate home obligations. My mom stared at me like I had spoken another language. "She's trying to get her life back." She said, "You can't take one day to help." That was the moment it clicked for me. Helping only counted if it came without resistance. The second I had needs of my own. I was difficult. By the end of the week, my dad told me we needed to have a talk. I thought it was about the thermostat or something minor. Instead, I walked into the dining room to find them sitting like a panel of judges, papers spread out, faces set. Tamara didn't even look up. My dad said it wasn't personal, just that they felt I had outgrown the house. He said Tamara needed room to reset, and I should consider finding my own space. My mom tried to soften it by saying I was independent enough now to fly on my own. And Tamara, without flinching, said, "Maybe we'd all have more peace if the energy shifted around here." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. I sat there, listening to them explain why it made sense for me to leave. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I no longer fit the picture they wanted to paint. It was a surreal kind of detachment, hearing your own family gently erase you from your own story. They gave me a week. 1 week to move out. 1 week to find a new place, pack, and disappear. No offer to help. No plan to cover what they owed me. Just a casual, collective decision that I no longer belonged. What they didn't know was that I had been holding back a truth that could rewrite everything they believed. And now, for the first time in my life, I was ready to use it. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the same bed I had once shared with Grandma June during her final weeks, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun silently above me. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to settle. Every word from that conversation replayed in my head like a loop I couldn't break. I remembered how casually they said it, how certain they were that I'd simply go, that I'd accept their version of the story like I always had, that I would shrink myself again for the comfort of people who didn't even pretend to care what happened to me next. At around 3 a.m., I got up and went to my dresser. In the bottom drawer, beneath an old stack of tax receipts and a folder of work contracts, was a manila envelope. I had placed it there 2 years earlier after the call with Mr. Ellis, Grandma June's lawyer. The contents hadn't changed, but I had. I opened the folder and took out the deed, the notarized paperwork, and the transfer documents with my name written clearly across the top. Jordan Woods, sole owner. No caveats, no shared claims. It had always been mine. Grandma June hadn't done this out of spite. She had done it out of clarity. She had seen something long before I allowed myself to acknowledge it. She saw how invisible I had become in this house, how my kindness had been slowly weaponized against me. That was the word Mr. Ellis had used during our first meeting. Weaponized. At the time, it felt too strong. Now it didn't feel strong enough. I didn't storm into the dining room with the papers the next morning. I didn't raise my voice or demand answers. Instead, I folded the documents neatly and placed them back in the envelope. Then I made coffee like I always did. I packed my lunch and left for work on time. I responded to Tamara's sarcastic text about how adulting is hard without chauffeurs with a simple thumbs-up emoji. I acted like I was complying, like I was quietly preparing to move out, like I had accepted my place on the outside of the family story. But I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to reclaim what had been mine all along. The next few days were a strange kind of theater. My parents began acting overly polite, avoiding confrontation, offering lukewarm small talk over breakfast. Tamara, on the other hand, leaned in fully. She played the role of head of household, directing conversations, assigning chores, making comments about what she planned to do with her space once I was gone. I listened, nodded, and kept notes. I took pictures of the rooms, saved screenshots of my bank transfers for bills they never contributed to, and called Mr. Ellis for a quiet legal consultation. He answered on the second ring. When I told him what had happened, he didn't sound surprised. "Miss Woods," he said, "you are the legal property owner. They are guests, regardless of how they view it, if you choose to remove them. You are well within your rights." I asked him to draft a formal 30-day notice. I didn't want drama. I wanted documentation, something clear, legal, and binding. He agreed and said he'd have the paperwork ready by Friday. That evening, while they were all in the living room watching a Netflix show I had never been invited to join, I sat in my car and reread every page of the property file. I wasn't angry, not in the way I expected. What I felt was something colder, a kind of settling, like truth clicking into place, like knowing something fully in your bones and realizing the fight is no longer to prove anything. It's simply to finish what's already true. Friday came. I made dinner. Tamara made a snide comment about how she'd have to retrain the next person to make decent pasta once I moved out. I laughed softly and nodded. After dinner, I cleared the plates, wiped down the counters, then placed a clean white envelope at the center of the dining table. Inside was the legal notice. On top of it, I placed a copy of the deed. I didn't say anything. I went to bed early. The next morning, my mother knocked on my door with the envelope in her hand, her face pale and confused. My father stood behind her, holding the deed as if it were written in a language he didn't recognize. Tamara hovered behind them, her lips pressed into a tight line. I invited them to sit. No raised voices, no blame. I told them the truth, that the house had been legally mine for 2 years, that they had lived here as my guests, that I had continued paying for everything out of choice, not obligation, and that choice had changed. For a few minutes, no one spoke. Then Tamara exploded. She called it betrayal. She said Grandma would be ashamed. My father asked if I'd been planning this all along. My mother cried quietly and asked where they were supposed to go. I let them finish. Then I said the one sentence that had been waiting quietly inside me. You asked me to leave a house I own. I'm simply agreeing with adjustments. They had 30 days, no exceptions, no drama, just facts. The same way they had given me 7 days with no support. Now the roles were reversed. But I wasn't doing this out of revenge. I was doing it because, finally, I could. They didn't speak to me for 2 days. Not in passing, not at dinner, not even through the kind of clipped, cold remarks that once filled our awkward silences. The house went quiet, like the moment right before a storm. I didn't mind. Silence was better than watching them pretend to be victims in a situation they created. I went about my routine, work, gym, grocery run, laundry. I could feel their resentment pressing against the walls, but I had no intention of reacting. Let them process it. Let them stew in the realization that the person they had dismissed so easily now held the one thing they needed most. On day 3, Tamara finally broke the silence. She walked into the kitchen where I was making breakfast, leaned against the counter, and stared at me like she was trying to decode my face. "You really blindsided us," she said. Her voice was low, careful. I didn't look up. "You asked me to leave my own house," I said quietly. "I just honored the request." She laughed without humor. "This is about power. Isn't it finally having something over us?" I turned to face her. "No, it's about self-respect, something I was too afraid to claim before." She blinked like she didn't expect the conversation to end there. Then she walked out. After that, the bargaining began. My mother was the first to try. She came to my room one evening holding a mug of tea like it was an offering. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me she missed how things used to be. She said they didn't mean to push me out, that it was just a difficult time and emotions had run high. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I asked her if she remembered the night she knocked on my door at 7 a.m. and asked me to call in sick to drive Tamara to an interview. The one she didn't even attend. She didn't answer, just looked down at her tea like it held something deeper than what she'd brewed. The next morning, my father tried a different approach. He brought up the past. He reminded me how he used to fix my bike when I was a kid, how he taught me to change a tire in the high school parking lot. I remembered those things. I also remembered how he hadn't contributed to a single mortgage payment in 2 years, how he had criticized my work-from-home job as not real work, how he once said I should be grateful I didn't have to live in an apartment like those other girls who couldn't keep a man. Memory works both ways. I nodded, thanked him for the life lessons, and went back to reviewing a client proposal on my laptop. Tamara escalated next. She started leaving messes in the common areas, turned up the volume on the TV late at night, and slammed her door with a teenager's dramatics. I ignored it. She left passive-aggressive notes about missing condiments in the fridge, conveniently forgetting that I was the one buying them. It was her last weapon. The petty power play of someone who had no ground left to stand on. I didn't flinch. I didn't engage. Because the truth was, I had already left emotionally. I was simply waiting for the calendar to catch up. By the second week, Mr. Ellis delivered an official follow-up notice, along with a rent adjustment form, in case I wanted to offer them an option to stay under new terms. I declined. I didn't want rent. I wanted clarity. I wanted my space back. I wanted to walk into my kitchen and not feel like a stranger in my own home. I wanted to repaint the walls without needing anyone's approval. Most of all, I wanted peace, and I had learned that peace sometimes comes only after you remove the noise, pretending to be love. One night, as I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine, I heard my mother crying through the open window. Not the manipulative kind, not the theatrical kind, the quiet kind that sounds like a person grieving a version of themselves they can't get back. For a second, I felt my resolve flicker. For a moment, I almost opened the door, but then I remembered the way she looked at me that night in the dining room, nodding in agreement as they told me to leave. She hadn't flinched then. I wouldn't flinch now. They started packing by week 3, slowly, hesitantly, like maybe I would change my mind, like maybe if they moved slowly enough, the clock would stop ticking. It didn't. Time moved forward, and so did I. I booked a weekend at a cabin outside Asheville to give them space to move without confrontation. I told them when I'd be gone. I left the legal documents on the fridge, highlighted for clarity, and I left without saying goodbye. When I returned, the house was empty. No final notes, no dramatic declarations, just silence, the kind I had been craving for years. The first morning I woke up alone in that house felt unreal. The silence that had once held tension now wrapped around me like a soft blanket. No murmuring voices outside my door. No kitchen cabinet slamming at 7 a.m. No offhand comments dropped like needles into breakfast. Just sunlight pouring through the east windows, the faint hum of my coffee machine, and a quiet I hadn't realized I needed this badly. I sat at the table with my mug, looked out at the empty driveway, and exhaled without even knowing I'd been holding my breath for years. The house felt different already, lighter somehow, as if it had been waiting for this moment too. I spent the first few days cleaning room by room, not just dust and clutter, but energy. I gathered everything they'd left behind, boxed it carefully, and dropped it off at a storage unit. No dramatics, no vengeful burning of old photos. I wasn't erasing history. I was simply reclaiming the space they'd occupied like it was theirs by birthright. I chose new curtains for the living room, repainted the hallway in a muted olive tone, and rearranged the furniture in ways that made sense to me for the first time. The house reflected my taste, not some collective compromise where I always came last. I also started showing up differently at work. With less weight on my shoulders, my energy shifted. People noticed. Nadia, one of the senior designers I used to work under, pulled me aside after a project presentation and said she'd never seen me speak with that kind of clarity before. She asked if something had changed. I smiled and said, "Just the background noise." A few weeks later, I was invited to co-lead a pitch to one of our biggest brand partners. It was the first time I'd ever been asked to represent the company externally, and something about it felt symbolic, like the world had finally caught up to what I had been carrying quietly for years. Outside of work, I kept my circle small. I wasn't ready for big social events or deep reconnections, but I leaned into the few relationships that had always felt easy. Nadia invited me to her cousin's birthday dinner, and I went. Not because I felt obligated, but because I genuinely wanted to sit at a table where nobody measured my worth by how much I gave up for them. That night, I met Mason. He taught science at a nearby charter school and had a calm presence I noticed instantly. He didn't try too hard. He didn't interrupt or dominate conversations. He just listened, asked thoughtful questions, and smiled in a way that didn't ask for anything in return. We didn't exchange numbers that night, but 2 days later, he showed up at the coffee shop near my place and said, "I figured if I saw you again, it was meant to be." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Therapy also became part of my new normal. I found a therapist named Dr. Kinsey through a recommendation from a colleague. And from the first session, I felt like I was finally being mirrored. She didn't rush to diagnose or explain my family. Instead, she asked me when I first learned that love meant sacrifice. That question stayed with me for days. Because the truth is, I don't remember a version of love that didn't come with a condition attached. Dr. Kinsey helped me see that boundaries aren't ultimatums. They're instructions for how people can stay in your life without hurting you. Meanwhile, my parents and Tamara stayed quiet for the first 6 weeks. I didn't hear a word. Then came the slow drip of messages. My mom texted once, asking if I'd consider letting them come by to pick up a few forgotten items. I replied with the contact information for the storage facility. My dad sent a vague email about hoping we could have a real conversation sometime soon. I didn't respond. Tamara, ever inconsistent, went from angry to apologetic in the span of a single week. One message blamed me for tearing the family apart. The next admitted she was lost and scared and didn't know how to apologize properly. I read them all. I responded to none. Dr. Kinsey reminded me that silence isn't cruelty, it's protection. That you don't owe access to people who weaponized your kindness and only called it love when it suited them. I kept going, I kept breathing, and slowly, something unexpected began to take root inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but freedom, and freedom. It turns out, is loud in its own way. It doesn't need to announce itself. It just grows quietly in the places where you've finally made room for yourself. By the end of that 3rd month, the house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a sanctuary. I had learned to enjoy my own rhythm again, the quiet mornings and the long walks around the neighborhood just before dusk. I spent weekends trying recipes I never had time for, reading books I had left half finished, and listening to playlists that made me feel full in a way words never could, for the first time in years. No one interrupted my peace to demand something they were never willing to return. It was subtle, but every day I felt myself growing back into the space I had abandoned, to please people who saw me as a service, not a person. Mason and I started seeing each other more often. We kept things slow, not because either of us was afraid, but because we both understood the damage that rushed affection can do. He was thoughtful in small ways that felt revolutionary. He never expected me to perform for approval. He never asked for more than I offered. One night over dinner, I told him everything. The eviction, the silence, the legal papers, the years of holding a family together in exchange for breadcrumbs of affection. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he simply said, "That must have been so lonely." I hadn't cried during the entire conversation, but his words broke something open in me, not from pain, but from being seen so gently. Around that time, work was going through another transition. Our creative director moved to a new firm, and Nadia recommended me for the interim lead position. I wasn't sure at first. I had always worked behind the scenes, solving problems quietly, making other people look good. But she looked at me across the conference table and said, "Jordan, you've already been leading. You're just the only one who hasn't noticed." I took the position, not out of ambition, but out of readiness. Sometimes opportunity waits for you to be whole enough to carry it. Meanwhile, I could sense the outside world beginning to circle again. My aunt sent a message through a cousin, asking if I'd be willing to attend a family brunch. She said people had misunderstood what happened and wanted to talk. I didn't reply. My uncle liked a post I made on social media about workplace equity, then commented, "Proud of you. Kiddo, family's always family." I removed the comment, not out of spite, just out of clarity. These were people who stayed quiet when I was being erased in my own home. Their silence back then spoke louder than any apology now. Then came the letter, a plain white envelope addressed in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a single page, written in her careful, looping script. She said they were adjusting to the apartment. Though space was tight and tempers shorter than usual, she said Dad had picked up extra plumbing shifts, and Tamara was working part-time doing social media for a local gym. She ended with a sentence that struck me more than anything else. "I'm not asking to move back in. I just want to understand how we got here." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in my nightstand drawer. I wasn't ready to explain something I had spent years trying to survive. Tamara texted 2 days later. No apologies, no self-awareness, just a 3-word message that told me everything I needed to know. "Are you happy I didn't answer?" She didn't follow up. I understood. Then that she wasn't reaching out to reconnect. She was reaching out to confirm whether she still had a grip on my emotions. She didn't. That tether was gone. It was around this time that I started noticing small things shift internally. I stopped second-guessing myself in meetings. I stopped explaining why I didn't attend every family function. I stopped carrying guilt like a birthright. At first, it felt foreign, like walking with new shoes that hadn't yet molded to your feet. But with time, it began to feel natural, not selfish, not angry, just true. One Saturday afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and began outlining my next steps. Not just career goals, but personal ones. Where I wanted to travel, what kind of business I might build someday, whether I wanted to host Thanksgiving that year, or take a trip somewhere no one knew my name. I wasn't looking to prove anything anymore. I was simply learning to live without permission. The hardest part wasn't the separation. It was learning to stop hoping they would understand. That part still hurt sometimes. But I had come to accept that understanding isn't required for healing. It's a gift, not a condition. And I wasn't holding my breath for gifts anymore. Fall came quietly that year, and with it, a kind of peace I hadn't experienced since childhood. The trees in my neighborhood turned deep red and amber, the air crisp enough to carry the scent of dry leaves and distant firewood. I began taking early morning walks before work, often without music, just letting the silence move with me. I found myself thinking less about who had left and more about what I had reclaimed. The house no longer echoed with resentment. Instead, it began to reflect something steadier, something rooted. I planted herbs along the back fence. I painted the garage door. I finally fixed the sticking drawer in the hallway that had annoyed me for years. These weren't grand gestures. They were quiet affirmations that the space belonged to someone who cared for it. Mason and I had settled into a rhythm that felt easy. He wasn't trying to fix anything in me, and I wasn't trying to prove anything to him. We cooked together on weekends, shared our worst childhood hairstyles over wine, and read on opposite ends of the same couch without needing to fill the silence. He never asked for the full story again. He just made space for whatever I wanted to share. One night, I told him about the Christmas when I was 19, and Tamara got a new laptop while I opened a recycled gift bag with socks and a grocery store gift card inside. I hadn't told anyone that memory before, not because I was ashamed, but because no one had ever made it feel worth mentioning. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You didn't imagine that." You know, that sentence alone felt like closure I hadn't known I needed. Work, too, began to shift. My contract was officially changed to creative director by December, and while the title didn't change who I was, it validated the way I had carried others long before anyone noticed. I led our biggest client pitch of the year and secured a deal that helped our agency expand into new sectors. For the first time, I didn't shrink from praise. I didn't wave it away or redirect credit. I accepted it with both hands. Knowing it hadn't been luck, it had been years of unseen labor finally coming into focus. As the holidays approached, I felt an old sense of weight creep in around the edges. I wasn't dreading anything specific, but the season carried muscle memory of playing hostess while others took credit, of buying gifts from savings I never replaced, of hearing my name last in every toast. This year, I decided not to go home. Not that I was invited, but I made the choice before the silence could sting. Instead, I invited a few friends from work who had nowhere else to go, including Nadia, her fiancé, and Mason, of course. We cooked a mix of everything pot roast, vegan stuffing, collard greens, pumpkin pie that didn't quite set, but still tasted like comfort. We laughed at stories about terrible office potlucks, danced badly to old R&B, and clinked glasses over stories of choosing peace over pride. At the end of the night, I stood in the doorway and watched the last of them pull away, headlights fading into the quiet street. I turned back inside, my socks brushing against the kitchen tiles I had scrubbed myself, and stood still for a moment. There was no rush to clean, no one making passive comments about clutter or questioning why I didn't do more. Just me, in a house that now felt entirely mine, inside and out. A week later, I received a package I hadn't expected. It was from Tamara. No note, just a small brown box with my name written in lowercase letters. Inside was the bracelet Grandma June had worn every Sunday, silver with a blue opal in the center. I hadn't seen it in years. I stared at it for a long time before placing it gently in my dresser drawer. I didn't know if it was an apology, a peace offering, or just an attempt to make herself feel better. I wasn't angry, but I didn't respond either. Dr. Kinsey called that moment an emotional border, something you acknowledge without needing to cross. That's where I left it. No long texts, no Instagram captions, just a quiet pause between what was and what didn't have to be anymore. By January, I had settled into something I didn't recognize at first. Not just stability, not just solitude. It was something fuller than peace. It was ownership, both of my home and of my own voice. For years, I had been living like I was borrowing space, not just physically but emotionally. I moved like someone waiting to be questioned, spoken over, or replaced. Now, for the first time, my steps didn't hesitate. I didn't owe anyone explanations for how I arranged my day or spent my money. I could choose silence, and no one took it personally. I could speak plainly, and no one twisted my words into guilt. Mason had started staying over some weekends, but it never felt like an intrusion. He respected the boundaries I had rebuilt with care, and he didn't ask for more than I could offer. One evening, while folding laundry together, he looked around the room and said, "You built something here that feels like exhale." I smiled because I knew exactly what he meant. I didn't decorate to impress anyone. I didn't arrange the living room for Instagram. Everything had a purpose that made sense to me. Every object, every color, every photo still displayed was chosen, not kept from obligation. Even the light in the house felt different, softer somehow. Maybe it was just me, finally able to see it. Then one Thursday afternoon, I received an email from Tamara's old firm. It was a routine outreach from a new contact there, inviting me to lead a brand strategy workshop as part of a reorganization project. I stared at the screen for a long time. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same company that had let Tamara go now wanted me to teach their senior staff about storytelling, messaging, and clarity. I replied politely, scheduled the consultation, and didn't mention it to anyone, not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer needed to be a moment of triumph over someone else. It was just a step forward that belonged to me. When I arrived at their downtown office 2 weeks later, I walked past the lobby where Tamara used to post selfies in designer heels. The receptionist greeted me with a smile and offered coffee. The meeting room had floor-to-ceiling windows and a whiteboard filled with overlapping arrows and jargon. I ran the session cleanly, answered questions directly, and left without any sense of performance. I didn't pause to linger on the hallway where Tamara's name used to be on a door plate. I didn't think about how she had once told me I didn't understand ambition. I just walked out, took a deep breath in the cold February air, and called Mason to see if he wanted Thai takeout for dinner. Later that week, I received a voicemail from my father. His voice sounded tired, less combative than I remembered. He didn't say much, just that he hoped I was well, that he'd heard about the promotion, and that he was sorry for how things had unfolded. No details, no request for contact, just a handful of words left hanging in digital space. I didn't delete it. I didn't respond either. Dr. Kinsey once told me that some apologies are meant to be acknowledgments, not doorways. I chose to let that one stay right where it was, marked as read, nothing more. The seasons turned again, and spring came early that year. I hosted my first garden brunch in the backyard, surrounded by people who didn't want anything from me but presents. Nadia brought a peach galette. Mason made sweet tea that was too strong, but no one complained. And our new intern brought his rescue dog, who spent the afternoon chasing bees and falling asleep in the shade. We sat on folding chairs I borrowed from the neighbor and passed around mismatched plates, like it was a tradition we had been doing for years. No one asked where my parents were. No one brought up who wasn't there. It didn't feel like anything was missing. I didn't plan to build a new family. I just started saying no to the people who treated me like a convenience, and yes to the ones who showed up with presents instead of demands. In doing so, something soft began to root, not a replacement for what I'd lost, but a reminder of what I'd always deserved. Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the last guest had gone, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the wind carried the first scent of early blooms. I thought about Grandma June. I thought about how she had known before I did that love without respect isn't love at all. I whispered a thank you into the quiet, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something I needed to earn. In early May, I received a letter from Tamara, not a text, not a voicemail, but a real letter in a soft pink envelope, addressed in her careful handwriting. I hesitated before opening it, letting it sit on the entry table for a day or two. There was no urgency, no rush to reopen something I had spent the past year closing. But eventually, curiosity won over. I opened it while sitting at the dining table, the same table where they had once voted me out of my own life. Her letter was long, almost 4 pages. She didn't beg for forgiveness or try to rewrite what had happened. Instead, she described what she had been learning in therapy. She wrote about her pattern of entitlement, about how being praised constantly as a child taught her to expect the world to adjust to her emotions. She acknowledged that she used me as a mirror, and when I stopped reflecting what she needed, she punished me for it. She ended with a sentence I didn't expect. You didn't deserve what we did to you. I'm sorry it took losing you to understand that. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated either. Just quiet, like something had shifted again, but not in a dramatic way. More like a tree finally accepting that a season had ended. Even if the leaves didn't fall all at once, I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't ready to enter a conversation just because someone else finally was. I had learned that healing doesn't always come with a reunion. Sometimes it comes with stillness, with holding space for someone else's growth without letting it interrupt your own. A few days later, I ran into a childhood neighbor while grocery shopping. She asked if I had heard about my parents. I hadn't, apparently. Their lease on the apartment had ended, and they were struggling to find a new place. My father had injured his shoulder and could no longer take certain plumbing contracts. My mother had picked up work at a daycare, but the pay barely covered essentials. The news didn't shock me. The financial imbalance had always existed. It just used to be hidden behind my quiet contributions. Now that I was no longer buffering the weight, they were left to carry what had always been theirs. That night, I sat on the back steps with a cup of herbal tea and let the information settle. I wasn't cold about it, but I didn't feel guilt either. I had spent years carrying everyone else's burden, waiting for someone to notice I was sinking. They hadn't. Now they were facing what life looked like without a scapegoat. It wasn't my job to fix that. Mason sat beside me, silent as always until I was ready to speak. I told him everything, about the letter, the neighbor, the part of me that still wondered if compassion meant returning to old patterns. He let the silence stretch before saying, "Compassion doesn't require self-abandonment. You can care and still keep your distance." His words stayed with me. They reminded me that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks you control. I didn't have to reopen anything. I didn't have to punish anyone. I just had to continue walking in the direction of who I was becoming. The person who no longer waited to be chosen by people who never truly saw her. The person who no longer confused duty with worth. The next week, I made a decision, not a dramatic one, just a simple shift. I donated the storage unit where I had kept the last of my family's belongings. I had paid the monthly fee for over a year. Even after asking them to pick everything up, they never did. The unit was filled with things they had left behind carelessly, expecting me to store their mess like I always had. I hired a removal service, gave away what could be used, and discarded the rest. It wasn't revenge, it was release. That same evening, I walked through the now fully uncluttered house and lit a candle in each room. I wasn't spiritual in any formal sense, but something about the ritual felt necessary, not to cleanse the house of bad energy, but to honor how far I had come. Each flame flickered like a reminder that clarity isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives in quiet decisions, in steady breath, in finally choosing yourself over everyone's expectations. As I stood at the window watching the candles glow against the glass, I realized I hadn't thought about being kicked out in a long time. That phrase no longer held weight, because I hadn't lost a home. I had reclaimed one. I hadn't been erased. I had rewritten the story. A year after they told me to leave, I hosted a dinner in the same house they once tried to take from me, not out of revenge, not to prove anything, but because I wanted to fill this space with voices that lifted, not drained. It was a warm evening in June. The table was set simply linen napkins, mismatched plates, a pitcher of sangria in the center. Mason grilled salmon on the back patio while Nadia chopped herbs in the kitchen. Marcus brought his partner, and our intern, Theo, came straight from work still wearing his badge. Nobody asked for perfection. Nobody tried to dominate the room. There was laughter, unevenly folded chairs, and stories that wandered off track without anyone needing to correct them. At one point, someone asked about a painting in the hallway. It was an old piece Grandma June had hung years ago, a landscape with faded blues and golds. I told them it had belonged to her, that this had once been her house. And someone said, "She must have been proud of you." I didn't respond right away, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally understood the full weight of that idea. Proud doesn't always mean grand. Sometimes it means peaceful. And yes, I think she would have been. I never fully cut my family off. I just stopped inviting them into places where they had proven they couldn't respect the furniture. Tamara still sent occasional messages, usually neutral, sometimes sincere. I responded once, a short note wishing her well. My mother wrote again around the holidays, saying she missed the smell of the house, missed the sound of me in the kitchen. I read the message, then lit a candle and made tea. That was enough. I wasn't angry. I was just full. And you don't pour into the hands that dropped you unless you're ready to risk the spill all over again. Sometimes I imagined what would have happened if I had left that day without speaking, if I had taken my keys, walked out, and let them claim a house that never belonged to them. I imagined them redecorating, repainting, filling the walls with stories that erased me. And then I imagined what it meant to stay, to assert what was mine, to calmly reclaim the room they thought they could exile me from. That wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a declaration. I mattered, even when they pretended I didn't. Mason and I never rushed anything, but that summer, we started talking about merging homes. He loved his place small, quiet, with a garden, but he admitted the way my house held space for people made it feel more like a home. We made no plans, no promises, just shared a language of patience that let us both arrive where we needed to, together, when the time was right. I kept going to therapy. I kept showing up to work with clarity. I kept saying no when my gut whispered discomfort. And yes, when something felt rooted in truth, the version of me who once begged silently to be noticed had learned to recognize her own voice. And she was done whispering. On the anniversary of that dinner table confrontation, I took the afternoon off and walked through each room of my home. I didn't do it for nostalgia. I did it as a reminder that even in silence, something in me had always known what I deserved. I walked past the windows they once planned to replace without asking me. I stood in the bedroom they tried to assign to someone else. I looked at the fireplace where I once overheard them say I was too comfortable in a house I had kept standing, and I smiled. Because I wasn't just comfortable now. I was solid. I was whole. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was choosing. Sometimes people ask what happened between me and my family. I don't offer details unless they're earned. I just say that I love people who didn't know how to love me back without conditions. And I let go before it broke me completely. They nod. Some understand right away. Some never will. I used to think closure came with a final conversation, with dramatic apologies or clean explanations. But the truth is, closure often sounds like quiet mornings, like laughter with people who never saw you as a utility. It looks like hosting dinner in the house they tried to make you leave. It feels like being able to sit in your own story without needing permission. I don't know what the future holds between me and the people who raised me, but I know this. The day they told me to go die and disappear was the day I finally started living, not in defiance, not to prove anything, but because their rejection became the door I needed to walk through to find my own life waiting. Have you ever been told to leave the very place you helped hold together, and what did you find when you finally stepped into your own space? Let me know in the comments, and if this story found you at the right time. I hope you remember this: real love doesn't ask you to shrink.